A very warm welcome to you all in the third day of this lecture series organized by the Department of English, Kharagpur College, in the collaboration of the Department of English, IGRA SSB College. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce our speaker today. We are privileged and greatly honored to have Dr. Jolly Das with us. Thank you, ma'am. Dr. Das was the former associate professor of Raja Pyari Mohan College, Uttarpara. Presently, she is the associate professor and head of the Department of English, Vidyasagar University. Her areas of interest include modern British drama, Indian theatre, diasporic literature, the social relevance of the cult of Manusha, photo narration of Adivasi life. Apart from this, her field of specialization is Girish Karnad studies, T.S. Eliot studies, and Adivasi related literature in English translation. She has presented many insightful papers at several conferences, and her research articles have been published in numerous reputed national and international journals. She is the author of many books, and she is my teacher also, and I know her that she is an avid reader and a passionate teacher and very helpful too. And she is an inspiration to many. Today, she will deliver a lecture on T.S. Eliot's poetic theory and praxis. Over to you, ma'am. Thank you. Hello. Uh,
Heard?
Good morning, ma'am.
Yes, good morning. Can I be heard?
Yes, ma'am. We can hear
Okay,
you.
thank you. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Very good morning to all of you. Every tolerance has two aspects, the good and the bad. And the same for this COVID-19 pandemic. I'll leave the bad aspect out this wonderful morning because all of you are here and focus on the good one, which is the innovative alternative which the indomitable academia have devised in order to combat this lockdown deadlock, so to say, and continue with the teaching learning process, which is one of the essential criteria for any kind of dissemination of knowledge. Seminars online, now we know they are called webinars, are doing a wonderful medical task of keeping us connected, making us interact with each other, bringing us technologically together while abiding by the government ordained norms of safety. In brief, saving us from depression and alienation. These webinars would not have been possible without the enthusiastic, innovative initiative of persons like Sri Jayanto Murmu, Head of the Department of English, UG and PG, Kharagpur College, and his colleagues in the department, Sri Shomaprato Shil, Sri Chinmoy Mondol, Sri Somnath Pal, Srimati Sreyoshi Roy, who just introduced me, Sri Shishir Shatra, Dr. Sudipto Narayan Das Mondol, Sri Indranil Mohapatro, and Srimati Somali Nondi, and of course, Dr. Oloy Chand Bishas, Head of the Department of English, SSB College, EGRA, who are collaborating with the Department of English of Kharagpur College, and Sri Poetic Pradhan of Agra SSB College, who has played a key role in this organization of the lecture series, and his other colleagues in the Department of English in SSB College, Agra. I thank them all for organizing a wonderful lecture series for the students. And of course, a very special congratulatory salutation is offered to the principals of the two colleges. Before I begin today's discussion, I must offer my respect to the person who has taught me to love T.S. Eliot, of whom I was very scared as a PG student and a UG student before that. That person is no more with us. He is Professor Subhash Sarkar, formerly Shakespeare Professor and Head of the Department of English, Rabindra Bharati University, and he has been recognized as one of the top 20 scholars on T.S. Eliot by the dictionaries of literary biography, both in England and in America. So my pranam to my late sir. With his blessings, I hope I'll be able to share some of what he has taught me with you today. The topic of my discussion today is T.S. Eliot's poetic theory and practice or praxis. Now, it is obvious that it is a very broad topic. So, at the outset, I shall be specific by telling you what I shall not discuss. I shall not refer to T.S. Eliot's letters, and I shall not refer to many other essays and lectures by T.S. Eliot. Now, if we look at T.S. Eliot's writings, the available writings today, including the letters to Emily Hale, which have been published early this year by Princeton University. They have been made public. They have not been published, I'm sorry, for researchers to go through. I have not been able to access them because they are not available online, but they will shed definitely very new light on our understanding of the mind behind the work of T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot's creative output is comparatively very small when you look at his critical observations. His critical observations, in turn, can be broadly divided into two groups. One, the public comments, observations he made by way of lectures, book reviews, essays which got published subsequently as anthologies or did not get published but are available for the reading of the general public. He wrote them or spoke them that way. There are the other very large number of personal letters which he wrote to different persons and in which he has shared many of his views on literature and on criticism. So the letters themselves are a vast repository from where we can understand the kind of person T.S. Eliot was as a critic and as a creative writer. So I leave the letters out and I look at only those sections of some of the essays and lectures which will be relevant for our understanding of what is there in our syllabus. So that makes things very easy for us. Now, let us take a look at the texts which are there in our syllabus. We have three poems by Eliot, one in the undergraduate course, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, and two preludes and Marina in the postgraduate course. These poems are usually found, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock and Preludes, in the first anthology of poems which Eliot published in 1917 called Prufrock and Other Observations, and Then came poems in 1920. Then came The Wasteland, broadly speaking, in 1922. The Hollow Men in 1925. Ash Wednesday in 1930. But during 1927 to 1930, T.S. Eliot was writing those aerial poems which went as Christmas card content from his publisher. And in 1930, you have Marina, which is there in the syllabus. Much later, in 1954, he wrote another aerial poem called The Cultivation of Christmas Trees. Apart from that, we have the four quartets, which he wrote during the period 1935-1942. And there are other poems, major and minor. The first poem in Prufrock and Other Observations is the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. So, its position reveals the fact that it sets the ball rolling in T.S. Eliot's, and it creates the tone of that anthology of poems. Apart from that, what you have in your syllabus is Murder in the Cathedral, the first full-length play he wrote in to be performed in 1935 at the Canterbury Festival. It was a commissioned play, and it has a very deep religious intent behind its writing and its performance. It still remains one of his most popular plays, both in the classroom and on the stage. Apart from these three poems and the play, which are his creative writings included in the syllabus of Vidyashagar University, we have two essays, Tradition and the Individual Talent, written in 1919, and The Metaphysical Poets, written 2 years later in 1921, which is actually a book review. Now, these are the texts by T.S. Eliot which have been included in the syllabi. Now, we must note that besides Shakespeare, who occupies an entire postgraduate course, ENG 205 for BU, the other author who has occupied so much of the syllabus or syllabi of the English language and literature courses is T.S. Eliot. This shows how influential he has been in the arena of literature, both creative and critical. Now, I shall take a short break here to inform you that I shall not discuss in detail the texts in your syllabi because our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Ranjan Chakraborty, has facilitated the uploading of learning material by way of, number one, PPTs and video discussions in the university's website, which is accessible to all who are interested. Number two, videos in the Vidyasagar University YouTube channel. And Professor Indranil Acharya, my very respected and learned colleague, who has done his PhD dissertation on T.S. Eliot, has made excellent analysis of the poems in the postgraduate course, and they are available online. There are videos and PPTs in the same two platforms on Murder in the Cathedral and Tradition and Individual Talent, I'm sorry. You may refer to them if you wish. Now, returning to today's discussion, I shall invite you to take a look at those words that T.S. Eliot said and wrote as a critic, which will enable you to understand the mind that is making. Hello?
Ma'am, it's Chinmoy. Ma'am,
Yes.
your voice is breaking. Please use the microphone. Sorry, please use your headphone, ma'am.
I am actually
voice is
using
not-
my computer.
Oh, the voice is audible.
Oh, the voice.
Means it breaks.
Oh, let me see. Can I use both? Or let me see. Just a second. Then I'll
Yes.
have to get my headphone. Please bear with me till I get myself prepared.
Yes, ma'am.
I don't know whether this will work. Will this work? Am I audible?
Yes,
It
ma'am.
is clear, ma'am. It is clear. Maybe for network
Is it okay now?
Yes, ma'am.
problem.
Yes, ma'am. It's okay.
Okay. So,
Ma'am, your voice is clear. Maybe, ma'am, you are audible. You're
okay, this is better.
clear.
So, to go back a bit, returning to today's discussion, is this better? Okay. I shall invite you to take a look at those works that T.S. Eliot wrote and the words he said as a critic, which will enable you to understand the mind that was making the critical observations as well as writing the creative texts. In 1908, while in college at Harvard, Eliot came across a book which had a deep and permanent influence on him. We all know the name of this book. It is a book by Arthur Symons, and the name of the book is The Symbolist Movement in Literature. It introduced T.S. Eliot to the French symbolist poets, who were, among others, Paul Verlaine, Jules Laforgue, and Arthur Rimbaud. Among them, Laforgue had a lasting influence on T.S. Eliot's poetic creativity. Now, let us take a look at a few quotations which would be useful for our understanding of T.S. Eliot's poetic output. And when I speak, he writes, in the use of poetry and the use of criticism, the date is 1964, so much later. We must remember that he passed away in 1965. So at the fag end of his career, T.S. Eliot was writing about his poetic creativity. And he writes, and when I speak of modern poetry as being extremely critical, I mean that the contemporary poet, who is not merely a composer of graceful verses, is forced to ask himself such questions as, what is poetry for? Because this is an age of fiction, and yet poetry thrived. So what is poetry for? I go on with Eliot's words, not merely what am I to say, but rather how and to whom am I to say it? So the how and the listener are more important than the content. Why? We'll come to this later. We have to communicate. If it is communication, for the word may beg the question. An experience which is not an experience in the ordinary sense, for it may only exist, formed out of many personal experiences, ordered in some way which may be very different from the way of valuation of practical life in the expression of it. Unquote. The content, the theme, naturally comes to the mind of the poet. It is following the arrival of the urge to write about something that he will have to think about how and for whom, so that the communication becomes effective, and that is very important. Nearly 44 years after the publication of Prufrock, Eliot is commenting in 1959 on verse Libre, which he used in Prufrock and many subsequent poetic creations. And he speaks about this in his interview with Donald Hall who followed him very closely. This interview took place in New York in the presence of T.S. Eliot's second wife, Valerie Eliot, and Donald Hall comments that as he was answering the questions of the interviewer, T.S. Eliot was also looking at his wife, who was sitting by closely, and they were exchanging very meaningful looks, which Donald Hall felt had another meaning as he was answering the questions. And about verse libre, Eliot says, "My early verse libre, of course, was started under the endeavor to practice the same form as Laforgue. This meant merely rhyming lines of irregular length, with the rhymes coming in irregular places. It wasn't quite so libre as much as verse." So this is how he looks back at Prufrock and other observations in 1959. Then, in the same interview, he says, "That's one way in which my mind does seem to have worked throughout the years poetically." What is that way? Doing things separately and then seeing the possibility of fusing them together, altering them, and making a kind of whole of them. So you see that this is the technique that he uses in Prufrock and other observations, in the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, in the preludes, and many other subsequent poems, about which he writes in Tradition and the Individual Talent in the second section, where he says that it is the individual who has a lot of experiences and ideas in his mind, but he does not use all of them to communicate that particular idea or thought or emotion which he wants to communicate. He selects, and the selection is natural and brings them together. So this bringing together of apparently disparate elements to create a structure is what he is talking about in his interview with Donald Hall too. And he talks about them, this thing, following the publication of Tradition and the Individual Talent continuously from time to time. So, as I was saying, the content comes first and then its expression, which naturally suits the content, about which he says, "I don't think good poetry can be produced in a kind of political attempts, very significant, to overthrow some existing form. That is not tradition. I think it just supersedes." And this supersession, according to Eliot, is natural. People find a way in which they can say something. I can't say it that way. What way can I find that will do? And in answering this question, the creative artist will find the particular form which will be a medium for him to express what he wishes to express. One didn't really bother, and bother is italicized, about the existing modes. So it just happened. This is in the same interview. Then he talks about the social function of poetry. Why write poetry at all? Again, poetry was competing with fiction and with other media, including the film, by the time T.S. Eliot was writing The Social Function of Poetry in 1945. And he writes, "If we are to find the essential social function, look first at its more obvious functions. The first that we can be sure about is that poetry has to give pleasure, the kind of pleasure that poetry gives. So this pleasure is exclusive to poetry, and it cannot be described because it is felt by both the creative artist as well as the reader." And he says, "Every good poet has something to give us besides pleasure." So there is a qualification. A good poet does not just please, he gives us something else. What is it? For if it were only pleasure, the pleasure itself could not be of the highest kind. So, what is there? Again, I quote, there is always the communication of some new experience or some fresh understanding of the familiar, or the expression of something we have experienced but have no words for, which enlarges our consciousness or refines our sensibility. So, this is how the poet helps us to understand, to appreciate what we already know. And he shares his further understanding of that familiar object or subject by correlating it with others in order to expand the frontiers of our understanding. And he says he has tradition and the historical sense in his mind, the first part of tradition and the individual talent, when he says, indeed, if an English poet is to learn how to use words in our time, he must devote close study to those who have used them best in their time, so the past, to those who, in their own day, have made the language new. So this is what he is saying. So he has to look back at former poets in order to learn from them how to make his communication contemporary and relevant. So what Eliot emphasizes is that the social function of poetry is, number one, to give pleasure, number two, to make a difference to our lives. He talks about then the language in which poetry should be better written. And in the music of poetry, written in 1942, Eliot wrote about the poet critic. What he writes about poetry, in short, must be assessed in relation to the poetry he writes. So he is also assessing himself. What he practices must match what he proposes or theorizes. And that is why we find that T.S. Eliot has continually corrected his theories, because he has discovered that what he had said in his early life could not be put into practice. He acknowledges it, admits it, says that at that particular time it appeared to be correct. But now I realize that I have to reformulate my theoretical strategies and stance, because what I had said is something which I myself cannot put into practice. So that is there. Whether poetry, I quote, is accentual or syllabic, rhymed or rhymeless, formal or free, it cannot afford to lose its contact with the changing language of common intercourse, because philology has taught us that language, a living language, is constantly changing. When I profess to be talking about the music, within quotes, of poetry, I put such emphasis upon conversation. So the conversational idiom has always been very important for T.S. Eliot, both in his poetry as well as in his plays, which are verse drama, poetic plays. Again, he says, the music of poetry then must be a music latent in the common speech of its time. And that means also that it must be latent in the common speech of the poet's place to which he belongs. So that again is very significant. It should not be only contemporary as far as he is concerned then. When he became a British subject, then it would be better that his poetry was more of British English than American English. Now, a few quotations for his plays, just a few. From the Three Voices of Poetry, another very important essay written in 1953. The first lines that is, the essay begins in this way. The first voice is the voice of the poet talking to himself or to nobody. The second is the voice of the poet addressing an audience, whether large or small. The third is the voice of the poet when he attempts not what he would say in his own person, but only to create a dramatic character speaking in verse. When he is saying what he can say within the limits of one imaginary character addressing another imaginary character. Now, before you throw a question at me, I ask you to ponder over whether Prufrock, the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, would subscribe to the first voice, the second voice, or the third voice. Again, Eliot says, I doubt whether in any real poem only one voice is audible. For the work of a great poetic dramatist like Shakespeare constitutes a world. Each character speaks for himself, but no other poet could have found those words for him to speak. The world of a great poetic dramatist is a world in which the creator is everywhere present and everywhere hidden. And of course, he talks about the creation of Burnt Norton out of certain sections of Murder in the Cathedral, which he had left out. And he writes, Burnt Norton began with bits that had to be cut out of Murder in the Cathedral. I learned in Murder in the Cathedral, which is his first full-fledged play, that it's no use putting in nice lines that you think are good poetry if they don't get the action on at all. That was when Martin Brown was useful. He would say, there are very nice lines here, but they've nothing to do with what's going on stage. Unquote. I would like to say two things here. Eliot had written Sweeney Agonistis, and Sweeney Agonistis came much before Murder in the Cathedral in 1927-28, and it consists of two fragments of a prologue and fragment of a prologue and fragment of an agon. And if you read Sweeney Agonistis very closely, you will find that it has all the important elements of T.S. Eliot's subsequent 5 complete plays. Between Sweeney Agonistis and Murder in the Cathedral, you have the choruses which T.S. Eliot wrote for the pageant play The Rock. And the choruses are also dramatic in nature. But it is Murder in the Cathedral which is very important, and E. Martin Brown has directed all his plays. They were very good friends, and E. Martin Brown has written an entire book called The Making of T.S. Eliot's Plays, which is very important for anybody who would like to have undertake further studies on T.S. Eliot's plays, because there Martin Brown writes about T.S. Eliot's being present during the rehearsals and his making comments, observations, and even interfering in the direction of the play, because he wanted the communication to be perfect as far as the speaking of the verse was concerned. Because although the plays were in verse, they were in blank verse, and they were supposed to follow Shakespeare's model, the model of Shakespeare, not only Shakespeare, but also of his contemporaries, and that is to speak verse as if it were prose. So I return to some quotations now on the critical essays. Eliot himself indicates that every statement need not be an integral part of a vast system. So some statements can be less important than others. They support but are not so important. However, there is definitely a systematic development of his thought, which is built on very definite perspectives, which he began to gather from time to time. In the 20th century, literary criticism, broadly speaking, according to Eliot, proceeds in two directions. The first is that of a reassessment of the greatness of the writers of the past. I think you can hear echoes from tradition and the individual talent here. Number two, that of the creation of new critical ideas. Tradition and the individual talent stands, therefore, as an important marker of these two tendencies. Eliot is chiefly concerned with the first, without which he believed the second was not possible. And that is why he talks about the historical sense. This re-evaluation of the past was begun formally with the essays collected in The Sacred Wood, published in 1920. Now, when Donald Hall asked him, "Do you feel that writing criticism has helped you as a poet?" Eliot replied in that very significant interview, in an indirect way, it has helped me somehow as a poet to put down in writing my critical valuation of the poets who have influenced me and whom I admire. It is merely making an influence more conscious and more articulate. It's been a rather natural impulse. I think probably my best critical essays are essays on the poets who had influenced me, so to speak, long before I thought of writing essays about them. They are of more value probably than any of my more generalized remarks. Now, Eliot was of the opinion that the distinction between criticism and creation is not possible. That is obvious from whatever little we've read till now, since the two are mutually complementary. This is what he writes in The Imperfect Critics. Not The Imperfect Critics, The Sacred Wood, page 16. And he talks about a practicing verse writer who should also function as a critic. That will make his verse sharper and more relevant for the contemporary readership. A true critic should, I quote, promote a pure contemplation of art, unquote, from which the accidents of personal emotion are removed. Eliot says something very significant about his conception of criticism. The perceptions do not, in a really appreciative mind, accumulate as a mass, but form themselves as a structure. And criticism is the statement in language of this structure. It is a development of sensibility. So, he has a bit of a scathing remark about those critics who say that Eliot pursued preconceived notions. So, in To Criticize the Critic and Other Writings, he wrote, "One very intelligent expositor of my work discussed my critical writings some years ago as if I had, at the outset of my career as a literary critic, sketched out the design for a massive critical structure and spent the rest of my life filling in the details. This will be refuted by the last quotation which I shall have for you." The subtitles of some of Eliot's critical volumes are interesting. They show how his critical insight was changing or progressing as you take it. They serve as important tags to determine the kind of essays included in each. Let us take a quick look at some of the more popular anthologies of essays. The Sacred Wood, 1920. has the subtitle Essays on Poetry and Criticism, very seminal. The Use of Poetry and the Use of Criticism, 1933, has the subtitle Studies in the Relation of Criticism to Poetry in England. So his place, his contemporary times, and he is trying to reassess what he has written in The Sacred Wood. 1934, After Strange Gods, a primer of modern heresy. And this is particularly a series of 3 lectures which he put down in the form of a published book, and it has got to do with tradition and the individual talent, to which we will come shortly. Essays Ancient and Modern, 1936, are essays on style and order. So he is ordering the way in which he would like his readers to follow his critical mind. Now then, we shall turn to tradition and the individual talent and a few quotes relevant for this very important essay. The question which comes to our minds is, what critical method did Eliot follow, if any? We could begin our quest with taking a look at The Sacred Wood, which contains many of his important critical essays, and then we could go on to the others to see how he kept changing his critical strategies as he got more experience as a creative artist. Some of these essays which we could look at are The Perfect Critic, Imperfect Critics, which has many subsections, Tradition and the Individual Talent, and Hamlet and his Problems. In these essays, Eliot attempts to define the parameters of his own critical credo. Therefore, in later essays, there is every chance that he would redefine the parameters of his critical credo. That was very natural. Now, he talks about bad criticism. He explains what he means by bad criticism. It is that which is nothing but an expression of emotion. Personal emotions can be expressed if they have a public meaning, if they have a public relevance. Otherwise, they'd better not be expressed. If they are expressed, then they are bad criticism. Like, let me digress a bit. This will be a very poor example, but as editor of my college students' journal magazine, I have had to go through many poems which very enthusiastic students used to submit for publication. And by now, most of you are smiling because you know what they contain. They are actually public expressions of very personal, euphoric emotions, mainly focused on the amorous towards certain ladies. And these, therefore, do not have much of public relevance, and then they would therefore be considered as the output of very bad poetic sensibility. Now, if that poetic sensibility is bad, then that is again a marker of a very bad critic. So bad criticism is nothing but an expression of emotion. Thus, Eliot's emphasis on impersonality and not on emotion or emotions, which are extremely important for the person but are insignificant for others, has been one of the foundational aspects of his theory of poetry. In almost all his critical essays on other poets, former and contemporary, he has used this eyeglass. An eyeglass is an instrument which is used by a jeweler to test the quality of the gems, semi-precious and precious, that he has to deal with. And this eyeglass is also called a miniature magnifying glass. So he has to be able to look through this, and that is his critical acumen, to see whether a poet, a poem can be a gem or can be rejected as less significant. Tradition and the Individual Talent is the essay in which T.S. Eliot explains this method, particularly in its second section. Thus, Eliot's emphasis on impersonality and not on emotions has been one of the foundational aspects of his theory of poetry. By emotions, he means very personal emotions which have very little to do with poetic expression of the thoughts and emotions which are going on in his mind and which will be relevant for his readers. Now we come to the preface to The Sacred Wood. Eliot was of the opinion that the distinction between criticism and creation is not possible, since the two are mutually complementary, as we have seen. And therefore, a practicing verse writer should also function as a critic. Here, he writes, hence, in criticizing poetry, we are right if we begin with what sensibility and what knowledge of poetry we possess, with poetry as excellent words in excellent arrangements and excellent meter. So they will help us to improve ourselves. But that does not mean imitation, because you will supersede when you will be able to supersede. The perceptions do not, in a really appreciative mind, accumulate as a mass, as he has said, but form themselves as a structure. So, in the introduction to The Sacred Wood, he goes on. It is a part of the business of the critic to preserve tradition, where a good tradition exists. It is a part of his business to see literature steadily and to see it whole. And this is eminently to see it not as consecrated by time, but to see it beyond time, to see the best work of 2,500 years ago with the same eyes. So the entire tradition of poetry writing will contribute to the individual talent of the creative artist. And that includes what the artist himself has already created, because that is a part of tradition. So, after nearly 15 years since he wrote Tradition and the Individual Talent, Eliot says that the problem is not so simple. And in After Strange Gods, he revises his position. And he begins the first of the 3-page Barber lectures, which he delivered at the University of Virginia in 1933, with the following words. Some years ago, I wrote an essay entitled Tradition and the Individual Talent. During the course of the subsequent 15 years, I have discovered or had brought to my attention some unsatisfactory phrasing and at least one more than doubtful analogy. And you know which one this is, that chemical reaction. But I do not repudiate what I wrote in that essay any more fully than I should expect to do after such a lapse of time. The problem, naturally, does not seem to me so simple as it seemed then, nor could I treat it now as a purely literary one. What I propose to attempt in these 3 lectures is to outline the matter as I now conceive it. So if you want to know more, please read After Strange Gods, which is available online. Now I shall turn to the metaphysical poets. And for this, the important book is The Varieties of Metaphysical Poetry, published in 1993 by Faber and Faber, edited by Valerie Eliot. The Clark Lectures, College, Cambridge, 1926, form the first part of this very massive book. In lecture 2, I'm sorry, there is a spelling mistake, Lecture, titled Donne and the Middle Ages, he writes about John Donne, whom he appreciated very much. Donne, instead of pursuing the meaning of the idea, letting it flow into the usual sequence of thought, within italics, arrests it. So the word arrest is very important. In order to extract every possible ounce of the emotion suspended in it. In thus arresting the idea, Donne often succeeds in bringing to light curious aspects and connections which would not otherwise be visible. I don't think that I have to elaborate that this is also the method which is adopted by T.S. Eliot from your reading of the poems in the Prufrock volume and the aerial poems, at least, if not the wasteland. It is not so much in the thought as in the development of the thought that Donne's metaphysical peculiarity resides. So the thought has to be developed. And he goes on in the same series of lectures in lecture 3, Donne and the Trecento. The Trecento is a kind of verse, 4-lined verse, and he writes, there are essentially two ways in which poetry can add to human experience. One is by perceiving and recording accurately the world of both sense and feeling as given at any moment. The other by extending the frontiers of the world. So a thought to Donne was an experience. It refined his sensibility. And then he expanded the frontiers of that experience with the help of various conceits. And therefore, the conceits are apparently unconnected but have very deep connections. In lecture 4, the conceit in Donne, he writes, the immediate experience passes into thought, and this thought, far from attaining belief, is immediately the object of another feeling. And this isolation of thought as an object of sense could hardly have been possible before the 17th century because of many socio-cultural, economic elements that went into the formation of the minds of the poets and dramatists who were writing during the 17th century. So the contemporary socio-cultural, even political ethos is very important for the formation of the mind of a creative artist. Lecture 4, the conceit in Donne, he writes, with Donne, the emotion, the feeling, does not simply stop at one point and verbiage begin. Rather, it is never verbiage because there is always some emotion or feeling present. We watch a strange kaleidoscope of feeling with suggested images, suggested conceits. The feeling is always melting, changing into another feeling. We get a kind of unity in flux, which is Donne. There is no structure of thought, but every thought is felt. Every image has a peculiar feel to it. This is the objective correlative in a new bottle. So I shall conclude with some more of Eliot's words and one comment by M.C. Bradbrook. Eliot's awareness of his function as a critic has influenced his creative writing so much that his poetry may be said to be the poetry of a critic, about which he has been speaking always. And M.C. Bradbrook has rightly pointed out that, I quote, his equipment as a critic is congruent with his equipment as a poet. Each reanimates the other. In B. Rajan edited T.S. Eliot, a study of his writings by several hands, is M.C. Bradbrook's essay, Eliot's Critical Method. So, I shall end this discussion with Eliot's own words. I don't feel that I've got to the point I aim at, and I don't think I ever will. But I would like to feel I was getting a little nearer to it each time. In the same interview with Donald Hall. So that is what I have gathered of Eliot's mind as far as the texts in your syllabus or other syllabi are concerned. Thank you.
Now the forum is open for the scholars and students to ask questions.
Rather to make comments.
Yes, ma'am.
Hello, ma'am. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can be heard.
Ma'am, as you mentioned and quoted by T.S. Eliot, poetry not only gives us pleasure, but there must be some kind of communication of some new experience. Ma'am, my question is that Eliot uses various types of, Eliot uses many of his poems, objective correlative technique for that kind of communication. Why he uses that kind of object to correlate with poet and reader?
First of all, the objective correlative is a nomenclature which T.S. Eliot has made. The technique has been age old. That is the first thing you have to keep in mind. He has not created the technique. It was there. He has given it a new name. He hasn't even redefined it. He has put it straight. All right. Now, what is the technique? There is always this problem of communication. Say, what I have said is something which I have understood in my own way, and I have tried to communicate what I have understood, but I am not completely successful, because there are many things which I have forgotten to speak to you. There are many things which I have not been able to say properly. So there is one gap in communication. Next, when I communicate, I use different kinds of techniques, different methods, different tools to communicate. Some of these tools are the images and symbols and ideas which I try to bring in, like I spoke to you about the poems in my college journal. So they are the objective correlative which I try to use in order to make you understand better. But of all the listeners, all the participants here, I can guarantee that each one has understood what I have said in a different way from the rest of you. So there are so many different ways of cognizing what I have said. That is a basic premise. Therefore, the use of objective correlatives is an imperative, is something which you cannot do away with in order to be able to communicate in a better way. Now, it depends on how precisely you can use these objective correlatives. For example, take a look at the first one, the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. There are so many things put in that if you annotate that poem, you do have annotated versions, good and bad. The annotations go into so many pages compared to the length of the poem. That is because he has said so many things with the help of those images and symbols that which he could not have said. And if he started explaining, the whole idea would fall flat, because there has to be the music of poetry. There has to be the colloquial idiom, the rhyme and rhythm of colloquial idiom. So that is there. But the fragmentary nature of the modern man's mind can best be expressed in this kind of verse with the help of objective correlatives. So that is how the content justifies the use of the mechanisms. Do you get it?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello,
Yes.
ma'am. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yeah. I am Chinmay Kumar Dhal. I'm pursuing my BA B.Ed in Regional Institute of Education, Bhubaneswar. My question is exactly, it's not question that I have a problem with Eliot, that when you are talking about the impersonal theory of poetry by saying that poetry is not a turning loose of emotion, rather it's an escape from emotion, and it's not an expression of personality but an escape from personality. I think that I have a problem with it by thinking that when, for suppose the first poetry of the world was written, probably it was written to express the undiscovered and unexpressed emotions of the world. So how far Eliot is correct when he says that the poet's job is not to seek the emotions? And it puzzles me.
I get your point. I know where you are confused. This is a typical confusion. Even I was confused when I was a student.
Actually, this confusion rises with one poetry of T.S. Eliot, that is the Journey of Mazai. where he is writing about the narrator's feelings and emotions and his opinion about his journey. So we are deriving, or we are interpreting it as Eliot's crisis. We may interpret as Eliot's crisis when he was converting into Catholicism or Anglo-Catholicism. But in a new critic's perspective, it's only the narrator's problems and only his feelings. It doesn't have any public relevance from the perspective of new criticism. So how can T.S. Eliot be justifying his theory of impersonality?
Okay, now as far as the theory of impersonality is concerned, here he is talking about those bad critics and bad poets. If you put too much of your personal emotions, which are exclusively personal to you and do not have anything to do with the target reader, he is always saying that you have to keep the reader in mind, and you have to speak in a language, and you have to use elements which the reader will be able to understand. Now, if something is exclusively personal to you, which is of no relevance to the reader, and that is what he explains in that second part of tradition and the individual talent, then it should better be kept to yourself. It should not form a part of that chemical reaction that takes place in the crucible of the mind, where different disparate elements get together in different ratios in order to form a new whole, which is the poetic creativity. So that is the impersonal theory of impersonality in art. You have to know how to keep emotions which are exclusively personal to you away from the reading public. Now, as far as the war poets are concerned, their emotions expressed in their poems were not exclusively personal. I am the enemy you killed, my friend, is not a personal emotion. That was the emotion of all the young men who were being thrown into a war situation by politicians who were far away from the battlefield. So they were victims, and it goes on even today, of a situation in which they are not the decision makers. So that was an emotion which is both personal and public. So that is there. Now, as far as journey of the Magi is concerned, well, yes, there is a personal agenda, but then again, it has a very deep Christian element. There are two things which you have brought in, things which I have not discussed here. Number one, new criticism. New criticism is something which many believed that T.S. Eliot had subscribed to, he himself did. But later on, he said in his essays, the essays to which I have referred, in other parts of these essays, he has said that it is inadequate, it is insufficient, and he very clearly moves away from new criticism. So that is insufficient, and he talks about different critical approaches, and he speaks about each of them in his own way. So I have not referred to those. The only thing which I would like to tell you is that he has moved away from new criticism. The other aspect is that T.S. Eliot, and that is part of my research, was actually undertaking a very personal quest under the guise of his creative writings, flanked by his critical works. And Journey of the Magi is one such poem in which he is talking about the nativity as a part of the incarnation, something which his Unitarian family did not believe in, something which he had come to believe in, and something which had actually drawn him towards converting to Catholicism. Anglo or Roman is not important, but Catholicism is, because when he was influenced by Catholicism, it was Roman Catholicism. When he went to a Roman Catholic church with his nurse, and he done way back in St. Louis as a child. But when he converted, naturally, the kind of the brand of or variety of Catholicism which was available was Anglo-Catholicism. So it was Catholicism which was important. And Journey of the Magi is a quest, a search which the Magi undertake in order to pay their respect to the incarnation, the idea of the incarnation or the validity of the incarnation. So there is a personal element, but again, it is also a Christian element, and therefore this is a very apt aerial poem. So the personal is not exclusively personal over here. That is what you have to be able to discern. Obviously, the personal will come into the creation of a work of art, but then that personal will have to be relevant for the other, the target. It may be the reader, it may be the viewer, it may be anybody, the listener, but it should be relevant and it should be made relevant. That is important. That is the theory of impersonality. I hope I have been able to address your problem.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
But last, I want to say that we have to consider it in a consciously or in a consensusly that the personnel that we have to disclose is not relevant for others, or whether it is relevant for other or not. But I don't think that we should leave it on the readers that whether it is relevant for them or not.
So that is something, that is why he says, see, now you have to go backward. You create a poem. Eliot is saying that just writing a poem is not enough. You have to be a critic. Then you go back one more step. You have to be a good critic. If you are a good critic, then you will know what is required. So that is how criticism and creativity are interlinked.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, ma'am. There is another question from Kajal Jha. He asked, why Eliot chooses Sweeney among the nightingales to become Sweeney agonists?
Sweeney among the nightingales to become Sweeney agonistes because he was tending towards drama, because he had the third voice of poetry in mind, and he had the music hall comedy in mind. And Sweeney agonistes is much in the tradition of the music hall, where he uses jazz music and the music hall tradition, fusing them together to write Sweeney agonistes. So it was, you can say, an experiment at writing theatre. So he was moving on towards drama with the help of music hall, with the help of jazz music, and he was experimenting with it. So Sweeney moves towards, from among the nightingales towards agonistes, and there again you see that he is using the notion of Greek theatre. He has got other things to say about classical drama, about the structure and the form which it has. So all his 5 plays have classical drama in the background as shadows, and the shadow falls on the plays, although they are not very obvious.
Ma'am, there is another question from Parthu Day. I'm quoting his lines. Respected ma'am, firstly, thank you so much for this fantastic lecture. According to T.S. Eliot, poetry is a turning loose of emotion. It is not expression of personality, but an escape from personality. While Kamala Das says that poetry is not a continual self-sacrifice, a continual extinction of the personality. I could not escape from personality. I have 2 questions in this perspective. According to you, which quote is more appropriate and why? This is the first question, and the second one is, okay, ma'am, please clarify the first question, then I will.
Okay, I think I'll take the first question. Very simple. Kamala Das is following in the tradition of T.S. Eliot. You will say, how? T.S. Eliot, in his own time in England, had formulated his theory of poetry. Kamala Das is a lady. She is an Indian. She has a completely different cultural scenario to face. And therefore, she has subscribed to tradition by reading T.S. Eliot's criticism and poetry. And she has also added her individual talent by superseding that tradition as was required for her own poetic expression. So ultimately, you get back to that fundamental notion of T.S. Eliot's, that you have to see what others have written before you add to that tradition. The pattern keeps changing with every new addition, and this change goes on. So Kamala Das has changed the pattern of the tradition of writing poetry in her own way. Both are equally laudable.
And the next question is, whose attitude is more important for the purpose of writing poetry and why?
Again, then that will go back to tradition and the individual talent. Each one has different requirements, as T.S. Eliot has already pointed out. It's not my words. And he has said that you will write when it will be necessary. You will know what form to write in, what form of poetry to write in. But the language, he says, must always be colloquial, as Kamala Das has also done. And both of their attitudes are right. T.S. Eliot, given the kind of background he had his own particular stance. But Kamala Das was fighting against so many odds, as we already know. So she was actually fighting against an institution where T.S. Eliot was an institution unto himself. So both of them are right in their own way.
Ma'am, and there is another question from Argha Kamal Guhara. I'm quoting his words. Respected ma'am, at first, thank you so much for your enlightening presentation. Ma'am, can you please explain what are the main disparities between T.S. Eliot and Wordsworth on the idea of poetry?
I can only say that you read the preface to the lyrical ballads, and then you read tradition and the individual talent, and you will get your answer. Because some of my fourth sem students are here and they will be rolling their eyes thinking that I will get going once again. So you have to read Wordsworth's theory of poetry, leaving out that aspect on meter, which is good enough. And then you have to see how T.S. Eliot is refuting Wordsworth's theory of poetry, because they are actually Wordsworth's preface to the lyrical ballads was the manifesto of romantic poetry. Tradition and the individual talent is taken to be the manifesto of modern poetry. Now, that would be a very long discussion.
Pavitra, if you have any question, please turn on your mic and ask the question directly to ma'am. Pavitra, do you have any question? Okay, ma'am. There is no response from Pavitra.
Thank you.
Is there any question from any other participants?